So welcome again, dear friends, to our satsang this morning. And as you know, we are studying the Vibhishana Gita, which is a conversation between Shri Rama and Vibhishana in the Ramayana. In this case, the version of the Ramayana, the Ramcharitmanas, authored by Sant Tulasidas. So just to begin, as I do, with just a very brief review of our class last Sunday, we looked at the question, who is the charioteer? Who is the sarathi? Because remember what is happening in this text, in this conversation, through Shri Ram, Tulasidas is describing the Dharma ratha, the chariot of virtue. And for each part of the chariot, he is identifying a very important life value, a very important ethical value. This is how the whole text is constructed. This is a chariot of virtue upon which we must travel the journey of life. And each part of the chariot corresponds to an essential ethical teaching. But last week we saw who is the sarathi, which is the Sanskrit word for chariot. Who is the sarathi? And his answer was Isha Bhajanu Sarathi Sujana. That the wise, the knowledgeable charioteer is centeredness on the divine. Isha Bhajanu. A life that is centered on the divine, on God, is the wise charioteer, the knowledgeable charioteer. And as I said, I believe this happens when bhakti, which is the love of God, and jnana, which is understanding the nature of God, become the basis, or at least one of the important sources for making choices and decisions in life. When we ask, how does my commitment to the divine, my devotion to the divine, guide my decision making, guide my choices in life? How does bhakti matter, or jnana matter to me in the conduct of my life? And then we also spoke about the shield. What is the shield of the human being on the chariot of virtue? And we saw the answer, virati charma. That virati, which is in Sanskrit the same as vairagya, is the shield. So virati is the transformation of attitudes and actions that result or that flow from the understanding of the difference between those things that are finite and changing and transient, and those things, or the thing that is eternal. The difference between, as we say in Sanskrit, nitya, infinite or eternal, and anitya, finite and changing. So, as I always emphasize, no human being can live without a need for things that are finite, but we should be wise about the limitations of those things that are finite. And that attitude is called virati, or in Sanskrit, vairagya. And that is, the result of that is santosha, or contentment. So he says, santosha kripana, virati charma santosha kripana. So santosh is the sword. We are contented, santosha, because we are free from greed for the finite. We understand the limits of the finite. We understand our needs, but we are liberated from greed. And liberation from greed is described as santosha, or the attitude of contentment. We also saw what is the axe? Parashu. Dan parashu, that the acts, parasu is generosity, danam, giving, sharing. One who is content, one who has the virtue of santosha or contentment is generous, is likely to be more generous, is likely to practice dana, to share, to give, to be not only a receiver, as I said, but also a giver. A person lacking contentment always wants more and is unlikely to give. But when we are rich inside, we are disposed to giving. So this is where we start this morning. And then he asks then, so if the sword is dhanam, generosity, what is the warrior's lance or the warrior's spear? And he gives a prachanda. What is the warrior's, the virtuous warrior? What is this, the lance or the spear carried by the warrior on the chariot of virtue? And he says the lance is buddhi shakti. A very interesting answer. Buddhi shakti prachanda. So buddhi, shakti is energy or power. And buddhi is reason. Buddhi is reason. Buddhi is intelligence. He says here that the virtuous warrior has a lance or spear of buddhi shakti, of reasoning power, the power to exercise reason. So even as a lance or a spear cuts deep physically when it is used, separates. Similarly, buddhi or reason is our instrument for discerning truth from falsehood, discerning sat or satya from asatya, separating truth and untruth. When buddhi is exercised in this way, it becomes the same as viveka or discernment. In fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, the word buddhi and its derivatives, by derivatives I mean terms that are derived from buddhi, are used at least 50 times, if not more, in the text. It is one of the most commonly used terms, positively, used in a positive way in the entire text of the Bhagavad Gita, the word buddhi and terms derived from buddhi. It is so important that in one of the verses of the Bhagavad Gita that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, it comes from the 2nd chapter. The teacher there says, buddhi nashat pranashyati. Pranashyati is to perish or to be destroyed. So a human being in whom buddhi is not alive, who does not exercise buddhi, perishes, self-destructs, destroys himself or herself. The point here is, when we lose a value for truth, for satya, for discerning the difference, taking seriously, discerning the difference and differences between truth and untruth, we perish. We cease to live meaningfully. What Sant Tulasidas here calls buddhi shakti, the power of reason, the power of intelligence, is unique to us as human beings in a very special way. Buddhi shakti is the same as jnana shakti, the ability to inquire, the ability to weigh information and to come to a conclusion about what is truth and what is false, and to hold on to that which is true. This is unique to us as human beings. And if you think about it historically, you can see so clearly that so many of our great achievements, so many of the the achievements of human civilization are the outcome of the exercise of buddhi shakti, the exercise of intelligent inquiry. Just to use a contemporary example, we have vaccines. We have vaccines because we use buddhi shakti to study the nature of the virus. And with such shakti, we can develop therapies to neutralize the ability of a virus to multiply. That's all buddhi shakti. That's the pursuit of truth. And so, as Gita says, buddhi nashat pranashyati, we perish if we fail to exercise this buddhi shakti. And while the Bhagavad Gita speaks of buddhi shakti at the individual level, I think this insight, buddhi nashat pranashyati, that where there is no intelligent inquiry, one dies, one does not live. I think it applies equally to a nation, to a community, a culture that does not value reason and does not value the pursuit of truth is a culture that is on the way to self-destruction. And I think it is one of the tragedies of our times that we are rapidly losing this value for truth. And we are paying, and we will pay a very high price for this lack of value. One of the characteristics of the Hindu tradition that I have always valued to this day and will always value is its commendation of reason. One does not have in the study of religion, in the practice of religious teachings, one does not have to set aside one's reason. Reason is a friend. Reason is an ally of religion, not its enemy. And that is a very important virtue. In fact, in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, coming to the end of the text, his commentary on the 18th chapter, verse 66 of the Bhagavad Gita, the great teacher Adi Shankara says, and this is one of my favorite texts from Adi Shankara, he says that 100 Shrutis, 100 sacred texts may declare that fire is cold or that it is dark, but such texts possess no authority. Why? Because they contradict a well-known fact. So religious teaching should not be opposed to well-known facts. This is what buddhi shakti implies. Religious traditions ought not to fear truth, whatever the source of that truth. And so he describes this as something that we must have with us. This is, not a physical weapon, but it's a weapon of the mind. This value for truth and for the exercise of truth, and the fact that truth does not contradict truth, and religious teachings must be in accord with well-known facts about the universe. This is why I think historically, on the whole, the Hindu tradition has not had the combative relationship with science that unfortunately some other traditions have had because of this approach and value for knowledge and for buddhi shakti. So if the spear, the lance of the human being on the chariot of virtue is buddhi shakti, remember that, it's very important. What is the warrior's bow? What is the warrior's kodanda? Is bow. And he says here, Tulasidas says, Bharavigyana Kathina Kodanda, that the warrior's bow on the chariot of virtue is, and he uses a Sanskrit word here, Vijnana, is wisdom. wisdom. Or the highest wisdom, he says, bara vijnana. The highest wisdom is the warrior's. So one would say, well, then why is he following buddhi shakti with bara vijnana? Is buddhi shakti not enough? Why is the bow vijnana or wisdom? What is the difference between reason and wisdom, jnana and vijnana? So here is my thought on this. Buddhi, which we just discussed, buddhi shakti, reason, is a gift to us as human beings for discerning between truth and untruth. But it is only an instrument. I may use my reason, my ability to gather knowledge, to understand the universe in which I live, the whole world of science. I may use my capacity for knowledge, my capacity for reason to find more efficient ways to hurt others. I may also use my ability to gain knowledge to find ways to save lives, to reduce suffering. Some of the most efficient killers in history were Nazi scientists working for the Nazi regime. They pursued knowledge as the instrument of death, to find ways to be more efficient killers. Reason, therefore, must be guided always by a commitment to ethical values, all of which, when we think of this chariot of virtue, all of which were mentioned in the verses preceding. We saw truth, satya. We saw integrity, shila. We saw commitment to the well-being of others, parahita. We saw forgiveness, shama. We saw compassion, kripa. We saw contentment, santosh. We saw generosity, dana. All of these are the virtues that must inform and influence our use of reason, our use of the instrument of reason. In other words, reason must be grounded deeply in ethical commitments, or else it's like an instrument, like a knife that a surgeon uses to save lives, or a criminal uses to take a life. Reason can cut both ways. So when virtue unites with reason, so two things. When there is this unity of virtue with reason, and when such unity manifests in action, then there is wisdom. That's vijnana. That's vijnana. When reason unites with virtue and manifests in action, that's vijnana. That's transformative. That's transformative. So jnana is knowledge. When that knowledge transforms us and finds expression in a virtuous way of being, when it informs how we think, how we speak, how we act in this world, then it is vijnana. It is transformative. So vijnana is the knowledge that transforms and finds expression in one's life. In other words, it's knowledge that makes a difference for the good, both individually and the good of the community or the good of the world in which we live. You can think of it by remembering also the three processes that we've spoken so many times about, that in the pursuit of knowledge, one must hear, sravana. One must exercise one's reason, manana. But finally, that knowledge should be so internalized that it becomes expressed in one's very way of being, which is what the word nididhyasana describes. Assimilated knowledge, embodied knowledge, knowledge that is embodied in one's way of being, in the quality of one's relationships with others. So bridging that gap between knowing and being is a challenge for everyone. And that's when jnana is transmuted into vijnana, into wisdom. It's a challenge for everyone, whether you're a monk, whether you're a lay person, whether you're a sannyasin or you're a grihastha. This challenge is common, because avidya or ignorance, the effects of avidya or ignorance are very deep. They go very deep. They inform one's thinking, one's way of speaking, one's way of being in the world. And so if there's a different way of understanding, then that different way of understanding should also make a difference. Knowledge is a process. It's a transformative process. It doesn't occur in a single moment. It's a process of replacing avidya ways of thinking with jnana ways of thinking. So the best answer to the question, if someone asks, what religion are you? I think it's always better to say, I am working at being a Hindu. I'm trying to be a Hindu. I'm not, it's never an accomplished thing. I'm not a Hindu. I'm always in the process of being. I'm working at being a Hindu. I'm working at being a Christian. I'm working at being a Buddhist, to express the ongoing challenge of transforming jnana into vijnana, the ongoing process of transforming knowledge or words into wisdom. What is the warrior's quiver? That which holds the arrows. And here Tulasidas says that the quiver, he gives a very, every sentence is so beautifully constructed in the language in which he's writing, which is the Hindi dialect, Awadhi. Amala achala manatrona samana. He says that the quiver, and he uses two words, the quiver in which the virtuous warrior keeps his arrows is mana amala achala. Amal means, mana is of course mind. Amal is a mala without impurity. So amal is a pure mind. Achala, chala means to move, wavering. Achala is that which doesn't waver. So it's a pure and steady mind. Amala, achala. Amala, pure, achala, steady. But he uses in a very interesting, both words are used side by side. Amala, achala, manatrona samana. The quiver of the virtuous warrior is a mind that is pure and steady. So a virtuous mind, amala mana, a pure mind, which is the same as a virtuous mind, is calm, is steady. But a steady mind is not necessarily virtuous. A virtuous mind is steady, but a steady mind is not necessarily virtuous. So amala, or pure, signifies here a mind that is rich in all the virtues that he describes in this Dharma, ratha, chariot, and all that we have discussed in great detail, in this series of lectures. And I don't have to list them again: truth, integrity, commitment to the well-being of others, compassion, contentment, generosity, and so on. But it's interesting here that Sant Tulasidas puts purity, amala, before achala. He puts purity before steadiness. Why? Again, coming to the example that I gave you just a few minutes ago, acts of evil are easily committed, even more efficiently, by people with steady minds. My own teacher, used to always speak and remind us that there is a crime for which people are charged, and that crime is described as premeditated murder. Premeditated murder. That was an act of violence that is committed by careful thinking. Premeditated crime, a crime that flows or follows from careful thinking and planning. So the mind that is achala needs to be amala. These two should always go together. Purity and calmness, purity and steadiness. Amala, achala, manatrona samana. One is incomplete without the other. So if the quiver, in which the arrows are kept, the quiver is amala, achala, mana, a mind that is pure and calm, what then are the arrows in this quiver? As he's coming now to the end of the discussion, what are the arrows? And so he turns, in describing the arrows within the quiver of amala, achala. In fact, Tulasidas goes to Patanjali, yoga shastras, and he draws from Patanjali's description. So he says here that the arrows are sama, yama-niyama, sili, mukha, nana. There are many arrows, but these arrows are yama and the niyamas. So he doesn't tell us, he doesn't specify what are the yamas and niyamas, but it's a terminology that is familiar, occurs in many sacred texts, but it's really occurs at the very beginning of the yoga shastras of Patanjali. Patanjali says that the foundation of all yoga practice, the foundations are yama and niyama. So Tulasidas uses yama and niyama as the arrows in the quiver of virtue. So I'll mention these very briefly. There are 5 yamas. And always keep in mind, because yoga is becoming and has become very popular worldwide practice. But it is good to remember that yoga has always been taught with an ethical foundation. It is not simply the practice of mind control. It is the awakening also of virtue. It has a deep ethical character. And unfortunately, I think, if I may say, that a lot of yoga that is taught today is taught without this ethical foundation that Patanjali himself sees as indispensable to yoga practice. So Patanjali begins, very early in his discussion of yoga, he outlines yamas and niyamas. So what are the yamas? What are the 5 arrows, the 5 virtuous arrows? Yama is the first one, very traditional in the Hindu teaching about ethics, is, of course, ahimsa, non-harming, refraining from causing injury to others. Ahimsa is a negative word, ahimsa, non-injury, but of course, it has a very positive meaning as well as, as Mahatma Gandhi himself used to say, ahimsa is like a coin with 2 sides. One is that I refrain from causing injury to others, The second is I practice compassion for all, active compassion for all. One side is not engaging in acts that cause pain to others, and the other side is expressing an active compassion for others. What we have seen here as parahita, looking after the well-being of others. I think when we think of the yamas, first one, ahimsa, we have to think of all of these yamas both as having a personal point of reference, speaking to us personally about interpersonal relationships, but also about they have the social dimension. So today we have to extend the meaning of non-injury to the non-destruction of any part of our world, our forests, our biodiversity, the clean air that we wish to breathe. All these are included in the practice of the first yama, which is ahimsa. The second yama of Patanjali, so first is always foundational, non-harm, not hurting. The second is satya. We've spoken about truth. Truth matters. Truth matters. Let me just quickly say, there is a very important definition of truth. One of the important traditional definitions of truth in Hindu theology, Hindu philosophy, is that truth is called in Sanskrit, or the nature of truth is in Sanskrit described as Vastu Tantram. Vastu Tantram is differentiated from Purusha Tantram. So Vastu Tantram means that truth must correspond to the object that you wish to know. In other words, when it comes to knowing something, the nature of something, we don't have a choice. If I want to know the nature of fire, I can't decide. I can't be subjective and saying, well, it could be hot, it could be cold. Fire is hot. So if I say fire is hot, that is an example of Vastu means object. So truth is centered on the object that you wish to know. It is not Purusha Tantram. Purusha Tantram is subjective. So if I want to fly from Minneapolis to Miami, I have choices in my route. It's called Purusha Tantram. I could exercise a choice in how I get from one place to another. But when it comes to truth, to knowing the nature of an object, then that is Vastu Tantram. That is dependent on the very nature of the object. It's become it's an interesting problem in today's world. If you look at CNN, you see from time to time CNN runs an ad, interesting ad, which led me to think about this. It's a contemporary ad about Vastu Tantram and Purusha Tantram. I don't know if you remember it, but it runs something like this. This is an apple. Some people might try and tell you it is a banana. This is how the ad copy reads. They might scream banana, banana, banana over and over again. They might put banana in all capitals. You might even start to believe that it is a banana, but it is not. This is an apple. We have to run ads like that today to say that truth is Vastu Tantram, that an apple is not a banana, in spite of how many people might say that it is a banana, not an apple, but it is Vastu Tantram. An apple is an apple. So this value for truth, that's the second yama. Ahimsa, Satya. Third is asteya. Asteya is generally translated as not stealing, but it is broader than that. Let me just go back to the first verse of Isha Upanishad. You may be familiar with that very beautiful text. The Upanishad starts off, in fact, Mahatma Gandhi once said that if we lost all of the sacred texts of Hinduism, but we kept only and we remembered only the opening verse of Isha Upanishad, the whole tradition can be recovered. Ishavasyam idam sarvam. Yat kincha jagatyam jagat. Tena tyaktena bhunjita ma gridakasya svidhanam. What this means, very briefly, the whole world is embraced in the divine, Ishavasyam. The whole world of universe is embraced, wrapped, enfolded in the divine. Tena tyaktena bhunjita. Enjoy without being attached. Enjoy. Bhunjita, without attachment. Ma grida kasya svidhanam. Do not covet, do not envy another's wealth. So wealth here is usually translated as material wealth, but another's wealth could be anything that a person is successful at, accumulating wealth, success, fame, achievement. In other words, we should be generous of heart. Asteya is generosity of heart to rejoice in the success of another and not be envious of another's success. Envy is a destructive disposition. It can also lead to a violation of ahimsa, because you want to hurt. Through envy, you have a desire also to bring about the downfall of others, to hurt them verbally and otherwise. So one of the third yama is asteya, generosity of heart to celebrate the success of another. Fourth is brahmacharya. Brahmacharya is often translated as celibacy, but does not really. It may be translated as celibacy, but it's much broader than that. Brahma, look at the word. Brahma is Ishwara, the divine, and charya is conduct. How you conduct yourself is charya. So brahmacharya is conduct in this world or behavior in this world that is consistent with the nature of God. One who lives a life in this world, like we saw before, Isha Bhajanu Sarathi Sujana, one whose life is centered on the nature of the divine and expressed in his or her way of being, in his or her conduct. Charya is called brahmachari or brahmacharini for the feminine. So brahmacharya describes walking a path that expresses God and leads to the divine. And finally, the final yama is aparigraha. Aparigraha means, it's the same as dhanam, non-possessiveness, generosity. All of these words, they are very well constructed. Parigraha is fencing oneself around. Enclosing is an interesting term for generosity. Parigraha is fencing oneself around, setting up a fence, a narrow fence within which one lives. Aparigraha is living without a fence. Living without a fence, living without an enclosure, a narrow enclosure, which means a generous way of being. A generous way of being in this world is called aparigraha. These are the 5 yamas. So they're easy to remember, ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, aparigraha. And then yamas, and I said niyamas. Yamas and niyamas, he says, are the arrows. And niyamas we have seen in different ways in this text also. The first is saucha, which means purity. Antar, bahya, internally and externally, saucha. Santosha, we saw already, contentedness, freedom from greed. Saucha, santosha. Tapas. Tapas is discipline. Tapas is not, engaging in practices that hurt one's physical being. Tapas is discipline, balance, moderation, as taught in the Bhagavad Gita. Then the next is swadhyaya, Interesting. Swadhyaya is a study, self-study, swa-adhyaya. One's own study, one's own reflection is called swa. Swa means one's own adhyaya, study, one's own study, which is an obligation to study. Continuous learning. Learning doesn't cease. Adult, you don't cease to learn after you graduate from college or graduate school. Learning should be a lifelong process. That's called swadhyaya, continuous study. But it also adds the word swa, which means, it is good to learn from others, and that's commended in our tradition. One certainly consults and acknowledges, the teachings and insights of others. But swadhyaya is different from mechanically repeating or reading the words of others. It's making that your own truth. It's bringing to your own life experiences, your own accumulated wisdom, studying and forming your own conclusions about things is called swadhyaya. And finally, the final niyama is Ishwara Pranithana, which is the same as Isha Bhajanu that we've seen before. Ishwara Pranithana means centering oneself, a life that is grounded and centered in the divine. So again, if you're practicing traditional yoga, you can't practice if you're taking it very seriously. Ishwara is very important. Ishwara Pranidhana, centeredness on the divine Ishwara is one of the niyamas of Patanjali. So the yamas and the niyamas are the foundations of yoga practice, and Tulasidas here draws from this and describes these as the arrows in the quiver of the righteous warrior. And that quiver, as you remember, is a mind that is pure and a mind that is calm or steady. And finally, he asks, what is the kavacha? What is the armor that encloses the body of this warrior? And says, kavacha abheda vipra guru puja. What is the impenetrable armor? Abheda. Abheda means that which cannot be penetrated, that which cannot be broken or fragmented or divided is called abheda. Abheda kavacha. Kaha. What is it? And he says that it is Vipra Guru Puja. It is honor and reverence for one's spiritual teacher, but for all teachers. Vipra, for all wise persons. Honor for one's teacher and all teachers or all wise persons. Of course, one does not have a value for wise people if one does not have a value for wisdom. It is a value for wisdom that expresses itself in a value for wise people. Those who value learning, value those who are learned. So he just spoke about swadhyaya, process of continuous learning, that continuous inquiry. And a lot of that happens, through the study and association with Vipra Guru, wise teachers. I think it is very thoughtful here that Tulasidas, in constructing this sentence, speaking about what is the armor of the virtuous warrior, does not speak of honoring one's teacher in an exclusive way. He could easily have done it. He could have easily said that the armor of the righteous warrior is honor for his or her teacher. But he says, Vipra Guru Puja. In other words, one should not honor one's own teacher and dishonor all other teachers or be hostile to them. Honoring one's teacher should not be exclusive, but should extend respect for and honor for all teachers, because that kind of exclusive attitude is not uncommon, believe me. Many people have a very exclusive attitude to their own teachers, and sometimes lean towards denigrating every other teacher. So it's good to remember, see how Tulasidas frames it here. Kavacha Veda Vipra Guru Puja. Our tradition is one that welcomes learning from all sources. There's a very famous line from the Vedas. Ano bhadra kritavo yantu vishwata. Very beautiful statement. Ano bhadra kritavo yantu vishwata. Let noble teachings come to us, come to me from all directions. May noble teachings come to me from all directions, from all sources. In other words, let me not limit the sources from which I could learn. And so this harmonizes very beautifully with what Tulasidas says here. Abheda Vipra Guru Puja, honor and respect for all teachers. Ehi sama vijaya upayana duja. So he says, that this chariot, this Dharma ratha, this chariot, Ehi sama vijaya upayana duja. I don't know any other way but this chariot of virtue. Like this chariot of virtue, Ehi sama. There is no other way to a good life, to a meaningful life. Ehi sama vijaya upayana duja. There is no alternative, there is no substitute. If you're looking to live a virtuous and meaningful life, he says as he concludes Vibhishana Gita, I don't know any other way. Upaya. There's no alternative but cultivating the virtues that are enunciated in this Dharma ratha. And adds, to one who traverses life with this Dharma ratha. Sakha, my friend, he says to Vibhishana, my friend, Dharmasya asaratha jake, jitana kahuna katahu riputake. In fact, he says, one who traverses life on this chariot of virtue has no enemies. Has no enemies to conquer. It doesn't mean that others may not see you as an enemy or as an adversary. It doesn't mean that you don't have disagreements with others, or that you may not have, or that you will never have to resist others. What it means is that you are free from enmity. You are free from this chariot, frees from enmity. You don't perceive others as enemy, even those who perceive you to be an adversary. Your heart is free from dvesha, from hate. And this ties in very beautifully, as I conclude, with Sri Krishna's teaching in the 12th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where he describes the one who is dear to him, the human being who is dear to him. And he says, Adveshta Sarva Bhutanam, one who is without hate. Sarva Bhutanam, who does not hate a single being. Sarva Bhutanam Adveshta, one who is free from hate, who is free from enmity, as Sant Tulasidas himself says. Adveshta Sarva Bhutanam. Sarva Bhutanam Maitra, one who is a friend to all. Sarva Bhutanam Karuna, one who is compassionate to all. Adveshta Sarva Bhutanam Maitra Karuna Evacha. Nirmamo nirahankara, one who is free from possessiveness, one who is generous. Nirmama means one who is generous. Nirahankara, liberated from self-centeredness. Nirmamo nirahankara samadukha sukha shami, forgiving and santosha, samadukha sukhi. Such a person, Sri Krishna says, is dear to him. Yo mad bhakta sachame priya. So with these words, I conclude our discussion of Vibhishana Gita. We have seen so many wonderful virtues listed here. Sauraj, Dhiraj, Satya, Shila, Balam, Viveka, Dama, Parahita, Shama, Kripa, Samata, Isha, Bhajanu, Virati, Santosh, Dan, Buddhi, Vigyan, Amal, Achal, Yama and Niyama. And so I hope, and since it's the last satsang for this year, I hope that in the new year, this chariot is the one upon which we all travel. May we all travel in 2022 on the Dharma ratha, the chariot of virtue. And on behalf of my dear friends, Professor Prasanna Kumar and Dr. Shashikant Sane, I want to wish you and your families a safe and happy New Year. Before we conclude, I would like to invite Professor Kumar, because he was asking me a question earlier this week in our discussion, and I said, I want you to answer this question. So his question was, what is the essential teaching of the Vibhishana Gita? What should I take away from this text? How should I remember this text? So I said, you are the most appropriate person to offer us an answer to this question. And so I invite my dear friend, Dr. Kumar, to share his thoughts on this. Prasannaji.
Thank you, Anand. I have prepared my remarks, so I'll just read it in view of the time. Vibhishana Gita is a template for living a life within the orbit of ethics and morality. In our journey on the Dharma ratha towards moksha, we need courage to overcome many obstacles, and hence the wheels of the chariot must be made of valor and fortitude. The chariot must be guided by a discriminating mind that is illumined by the ever-present awareness. To face and overcome obstacles such as the six-headed monster, kaama, krodha, lobha, moha, mada, maatsarya, we need an arsenal of yama, niyama, shama, dama, titiksha, uparati, etc. Tulasidas has distilled the wisdom of the Vedas, Upanishads, the epics, itihasas, and other writings in his Vibhishana Gita, which can best be described as the spontaneous outburst of his most powerful inner thoughts. In secular life, we turn on the external GPS to guide us from origin to the destination. In the spiritual life, Tulasidas warns us, turn off your internal GPS. What internal GPS should I turn off? G, greed, P, possessiveness, S, selfishness. And Tulasidas advises us, turn on your internal GPS. What internal GPS should I turn on? Generosity, dana, parahita, welfare of others, and santosha, contentment. With God as your passenger, if your ego does not permit you to allow God to steer your chariot, at least be generous in allowing him to be a passenger. With God on your side as a passenger, Tulasidas guarantees that our journey will be complete and successful. To summarize, Vibhishana Gita is a short primer on the life's journey to moksha within the confines of ethics and morality. There is so much wisdom in these 4 stanzas that compels us to contemplate on his teaching, and not just contemplate, but put it into practice. Contemplation is think about it, but we must put it into practice too. So that's my thought on Tulasidas' the 4 stanzas.
Thank you very much, Professor Kumar. When we hear something well, we say sadhu, sadhu. So I say sadhu, sadhu to your carefully and well thought out words. It's a very crisp way of helping us to summarize and remember the essential insights of this very beautiful discussion. So thank you for the time that you took to write your thoughts. Very much appreciated.